Hi, I'm Lillian. Welcome back to my channel, Ink and Pages. This video is kind of a 3-in-1. I'm going to be talking about my reading stats from 2022, my least favourite and favourite books of the year, and then also all of my reading goals for 2023. So let's start with all of my reading stats. I finished 34 books in 2022. Here is what that looks like when broken down like by month, how many books I finished per month. The best reading month for me was April, where I finished 7 books, and the worst one was November. I'll just say right now, pretty much all of the stats I'm about to show you will have November as the worst month. That's because I did NaNoWriMo, which was a great time. I really enjoyed it, but I sacrificed basically any reading that I did. So don't think that I did much reading in November. I really did not. In terms of page count, I read 12,898 pages. That's a very exact number. I've done my best to make it as exact as possible because this also includes any pages I read towards books that I did not finish. Either because I've like officially DNF'd them, which I did for 4 books this year, or because I've just read a bit of the book and then thought, not right now. So they're kind of on pause, or I'm going to continue to read them into 2023. But here's a breakdown of how many pages I read per month. I much prefer this graph as a way to like judge my reading. April was still like had the most reading in it, but you can see it had some competition from some of the other months. For example, October, most of those pages I read in October were because of this really long Daredevil fan fiction that I never actually finished reading. And the final way we could try and judge my reading from last year is to look at how many days per month I actually read. So here is a graph showing that, and we can conclude, yes, April was like my best reading month. In all 3 categories, April has won. I think this is because of the readathon I took part in that month, which was the magical readathon hosted by G on her channel Book Roast. And she also hosted it in August or September, I can't quite remember, but it was like the April one that I got really into and had such fun time. I set up a special spread for it in my reading journal, which I was really proud of. So on to ratings. My average rating for 2022 was 3.2 stars. Which for me is like solidly good. It's not amazing. It has been higher in the past, but like it's not bad. This was also the first year I officially allowed myself to use half stars in my ratings. But for the next few statistics, I'm not gonna include the half stars. If I gave something like 3.5 stars, I'm gonna count it as a 3-star, just because otherwise I think the statistics look a little bit muddled. So here is a breakdown of my ratings. I only gave one book 5 stars in the entire year, and it was the last book I read. You'll hear about it later in this video. I gave 11 books 4 stars and also 11 books 3 stars. I gave out 8 2 stars, and unfortunately, I did give 3 books 1 star. Per month, here is what that breaks down to, like my average rating per month. Ignore the stats for September, October, November, and December, because in 3 of those months, I only finished 1 book. So this isn't an average rating. That's why December looks skewed so high, because that was the 1 book I read that month was a 5-star. Ignore the end of this graph, basically. Looking at this, I would say that March is obviously my highest rated month. I had an average of 4.2 stars that month. So next we will look at the genre of the books I read. Here is a pie chart. Unsurprisingly, the vast majority, exactly half of the books I read were fantasy books. I read 17 fantasy books, 4 science fiction, 2 romance and 2 historical fiction, 5 mystery thriller books, 1 memoir, 2 non-fiction books and 1 poetry book. For my age range statistics as well, also unsurprising, majority of them were adult books. There were 25 adult books, 8 YA books, no children's books this year, and 1 that I didn't really know what to class as, so I've just put other, non-applicable. Next, let's look at the formats and the forms of the things I read. In terms of formats, majority were simple old plain prose books. 28 were prose, 1 was poetry, 4 graphic novels, and 1 was an anthology or short story collection. Here is the pie chart for form. I love a paperback, and 20 of the things I read were paperback books. 7 were hardback, 5 were ebooks, and then I had 1 audiobook, which was my reread of Fellowship of the Ring, and then 1 book which I read in a mixture of forms. This was Spinning Silver. I started reading this as an ebook I got from the library, and then I was enjoying it so much that I went out and bought a physical book, and that's how I finished reading it. Now onto all of the book page statistics. The average length of a book I finished in 2022 was 333 pages. So a very nice round number there. Here is a breakdown of all of the different book lengths I read throughout the year. I was surprised to see that the biggest chunk of this, 10 books, were 200 pages or less. I guess I did read 4 graphic novels, but I guess I just read like a lot more novellas and shorter stories than normal, which is a little bit of a break from tradition for me, but very interesting. The shortest book I read was Galatea by Madeline Miller, which was only 32 pages long, not worth it. And the longest book was Kingdom of Ash by Sarah J Maas, which was 980 pages long, also not really worth it. I also worked out how many pages I read on average per day that I did any reading. So for each reading day of 2022, I read an average of 85 pages, which is very nice and actually a little suspiciously high. I'm wondering if I've worked that out wrong. The average time it took me to finish a book was 11 days. And then the books that I read the quickest, there were quite a few books that I read in one day. They were When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain, Galatea, Monstrous Volumes 4 and 5, The Sanatorium, and In a Dark, Dark Wood. And then the book it took me the longest to read was The Fellowship of the Ring, which took me 255 days to get through because I was listening to it as an audiobook and I would listen to a little tiny snippet of it each night before I fell asleep, which is why it took me so long. The next that I have is to do with the source of the book. So here is the pie chart for that. 5 of the books I read were borrowed, either from the library or from friends and family, and then 7 of them were rereads. 6 were books I owned for over 6 months before reading them, and then 16 were ones I owned for less than 6 months before reading them. The book I actually owned the longest before reading was Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman, which I got in June 2017 and finally read after almost 5 years. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the books Love and Colour, Spinning Silver, Down Among the Sticks and Bones, Beneath the Sugar Sky, All Systems Red, Book Lovers, A Psalm for the Wild Built, and The Paris Apartment, which I all read within 1 month of getting them. Next, we'll go on to all the authory statistics. So I read from 28 different authors this year. Exactly half of them were ones I had read from before, and then the other half were ones I read from for the first time in 2022. In terms of author gender, I read from 23 female authors, and then 2 male authors and 2 non-binary authors or of a different gender, and then 1 author whose gender I have no idea. This was the author of the Harry Potter fan fiction. And then for author race, it's not a very diverse bunch, embarrassingly. 20 of the 28 authors were white. I also read from only 3 Black authors and 2 Asian authors, and then 2 books whose authors were either mixed race or there was multiple different authors of different races, and then obviously one, the Harry Potter fanfiction author whose race I'll never know. Okay, we're coming to the end of the stats. Next, I looked at how many of the books were standalones versus series. So here is the graph for that. 14 of the books I read were standalones, 8 were the first book in a series, and then 7 were like the middle book of a series, continuing the series. Only 1 book was the final book in a series, the one series I finished this year, and that was Kingdom of Ash, which is the last book in the Throne of Glass series. And then 4 books were sort of non-applicable because they were like adult non-fiction. Finally, we have a couple superficial stats, quite literally. Here is a breakdown of the different colours of the book covers I read. Quite a nice mix. My biggest categories here were 7 multicoloured books and then 5 green and 5 blue. I did not manage to read a single yellow book or a single brown/beige book. But other than that, I got pretty much the whole rainbow. And finally, here is a little breakdown of the length of the book titles I read. The longest title had 7 words, and it is When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain by Niveau. And then I had quite a few books with only 1 word in the title as well. Neverwhere, Ignite, Galatea, Ariadne, and Nimona, which all had obviously 1-word titles. So those are all my stats. Next, we will move on to talking about my least favorite books of the year. I read 3 books in 2022 that I gave a rating of 1.5 stars, and they're all similar in that they had the potential to not be 1 stars. Like if I had started to read a book and immediately known that it was only going to be a 1-star book and I really wasn't going to like it, I wouldn't have continued it. So all of these had something about them, maybe a really cool concept that I was interested in, or a mystery that I wanted to find out the answer to. They had something that kept me reading to see if it was worth it. And obviously for these 3, it turned out not to be. So firstly was The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa. This one did have a really cool concept. This is set on a small Japanese island where regularly the inhabitants will wake up and find that they've all collectively forgotten something, an object of some kind or a thing, for example, ribbons or perfume or birds. But the author seems to have taken this concept and written the most boring book possible about it. It just fell flat in like literally every single way. I didn't care about the story, the plot wasn't interesting, the writing was, I think, very like cold and clinical, and actually the whole book felt that way as well. Didn't care about any of the characters. It just basically had no action and no heart to it, and I just did not enjoy any part of the reading experience. The main character of this book is also an author, so we get to read a few excerpts of her writing, kind of like a little book within a book. And when I tell you I hated these bits more than most things, it really cannot overstate how much I disliked them. I kept hoping that something would happen to make this book live up to its potential or to warrant its very existence. But I hoped in vain, and it just stayed bad all the way through. The next book on this list is The Sanatorium by Sarah Pearse. This is a mystery thriller about a troubled police detective who goes to a Swiss hotel to attend the engagement party of her estranged brother. But when she gets there, the hotel's really creepy, it's got a dark history, and then bad things start to happen. For example, her soon-to-be sister-in-law vanishes. And that sounds cool, right? It sounds interesting, sounds like a cool mystery I could get behind. I also picked this up, honestly, because it sounded very similar to the book One by One by Ruth Ware, which I'll talk about later in this video because I really enjoyed it. But it had the similar tropes of like an isolated snowy setting and then a core cast of characters who don't really know who to trust, and then you as the reader also don't know who to trust. But unlike One by One, it was just really bad. The protagonist, Ellen, was so miserable and stressful and honestly just exhausting to like be inside the head of. She's a very, very traumatized character, and I think the author just did this to her to make her interesting, which I didn't like. She also wasn't a very good detective, and all of the other characters also sucked. The mystery itself, which was the reason I was reading it, took a while to kick off. Actually, there was a brief window, I'll give it, in the middle of the book where it got pretty interesting, but then it was a swift downhill slope after that. And the final reveal was laughably awful and confusing and didn't make much sense. And actually not all of the plot threads were properly wrapped up, which was really annoying. And then there was a little tiny epilogue at the end, which was more confusing and was basically, it turns out, setting up for a sequel to this book, which I will never read. So finally, we have my least favorite book of the year, which was, unfortunately, Ariadne by Jennifer Saint, which was actually really disappointing and heartbreaking because I was quite convinced I would really, really love this book. And I think actually it could be enjoyed if it was recommended in the right circumstances. I was under the impression that this was trying to be the next Circe. Let me tell you now, it's not. If you want to read a retelling of a minor female mythological character who's often overlooked and only really talked about in context of her more famous male counterpart, the hero, the true hero of the story, and you want to see this character get a little bit more agency and control over herself and her story, read Circe. If you want to read a fucking miserable book about a wet wipe disguised as a princess, read Ariadne. I actually dislike this book so much it still makes me a bit angry. Because basically, at its core, it fails at its entire purpose and mission as a story, and it was dreadful. But now we'll talk about some happier stuff, I promise. These are my favorite books of 2022. We'll start off with a few honorable mentions. Firstly is When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain by Nivo. This is a story of a cleric called Chi, whose job is to travel around and record stories and local histories. It's the second book in the Singing Hills cycle, which is a fantasy novella series with a pretty similar premise. But whereas the first book, Chi was kind of like a passive observer and was the one being told the story to record it. In the second book, they are the one telling the story, and it was just very interesting. It was a little bit more exciting and compelling than the first story, which I also still really loved, don't get me wrong. This story also talked about the nature of storytelling itself and how a story can change depending on who's telling it and who they're telling it to. And it was just perfectly crafted, a little magical slice of goodness, and I'm very excited to continue with the series. Next is One by One by Ruth Ware, which I really enjoyed. This is a mystery about a company retreat to a snowy chalet in the Alps, and there's an avalanche and they get cut off from everyone and then people start vanishing. And this was just a really good mystery. It was exciting and compelling all the way through, and I loved the mystery itself and then how it slowly unfolded throughout the book, and then like the final couple reveals at the end I thought were also really good. It was inspired, I think, pretty obviously by And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie, and it was just so fun. I'll also give a shout out to Book Lovers by Emily Henry. I only read 2 romance books this year, but I can say this one was definitely the best one of them. This is about Nora and I think Charlie, who both work in publishing but kind of like opposing roles, so it's a bit of a rivalry between them, and they run into each other again in a small town in the middle of nowhere while Nora is on holiday there with her sister, and like they meet again, sparks begin to fly, etc. It was just a really fun time. I really liked the dynamic between them, and I also really liked the strong family aspect of this story. Obviously the love story is between Nora and Charlie, but for me the real love story was between Nora and her sister, and I did shed a tear because of this book, and it wasn't because of any angst on the romance side of things. It was like the family sisterly angst that really did get to me. And the last honourable mention I'll do is to Reputation by Lex Croucher, which again is one of 2 historical fiction books I read this year, but was definitely the best one of them. This is basically Pride and Prejudice meets Mean Girls. It's about Georgiana, who goes to stay with her aunt and uncle and then falls in with like the cool, rich, popular crowd of girls. There's great friendship dynamics and a little bit of drama, and there's a nice romance subplot and like a family relationships aspect as well. And it's also got some darker bits, which are perfectly balanced with the lighter bits, and it was just like a great book. It was a great book, one that I was really hoping I would really enjoy, and I did, so it was just a very fun, satisfying time. Okay, so my official top couple of books now. I reread A Darker Shade of Magic and A Gathering of Shadows by V.E. Schwab. I first read these in 2015 and 2016 respectively, and they are just absolutely incredible. I loved them, pretty much just as much this time around. We won't talk about how I tried to read the third book and got about 180 pages into it before putting it down because I wasn't feeling it. We won't talk about that. These first 2 books are incredible. They are fantasy books where there's basically 4 parallel worlds, and each one has a parallel London, and our main character Kel is unusual because he is one of very few people who is able to travel between worlds. And it's got shenanigans and magic and royalty and pickpockets and thieves and pirates and magic. I can't remember if I said that, I think I did. And it's got like a magical Olympics kind of equivalent in the second book, and there's like family dynamics as well. I think there's a tiny bit of romance. I feel like there's gonna be more romance in the third book, but obviously I haven't got there yet. And then there's like this dark, evil threat lurking as well, and it's just fantastic. It is one of my favorite series of all time, confirmed forever. The other book I gave 4.5 stars to was the Harry Potter fan fiction I read called Ignite. This is the first in a trilogy, very exciting. I really love Harry Potter fan fiction because I think it's the one part of Harry Potter which is not intrinsically tainted by J.K. Turfling. So I can read it and have a good time, and I would recommend you do the same thing. If, like me, you grew up loving Harry Potter, you can't stand to see what it's become, but you still want to enjoy the good parts of it, please get yourself on a Harry Potter fanfiction website. It is where all the cool kids are, I promise. This story is like a next generation one, which means that it follows Harry, Ron and Hermione's children when they're at Hogwarts, and it's a great time. There's like a magical plague. Okay, it's not a great time. There's a magical plague sweeping the school and they have to work out what it is and how to stop it. But it's just so good. It's got like friendship dynamics, family dynamics, lovely bit of romance, Tons of angst in a great way though. It's exciting and funny and heartfelt and heartbreaking in several places. If you've read it, you'll know. And I just fucking loved it, actually. I just loved it. It's perfect. It really is perfect. And lastly, I'm going to talk about the one book which I gave 5 stars to in 2022. I think I was maybe just a bit stingy in hindsight about giving out 5 stars. I think A Dark Shade of Magic, A Conjuring of Light and Ignite were actually all 5-star reads in my heart. But officially, I only gave 5 stars to my reread of Nimona by N.D. Stevenson, which was actually the last book I read in 2022, so the perfect way to end the year. As I said in my last wrap-up video, this is my perfect graphic novel. I mean, that it's literally perfect. It is about a girl called Nimona who is a shapeshifter, and she goes to work for the villain in the story called Lord Ballister Blackheart, and they get into all sorts of shenanigans, and it's got shapeshifting and science and sharks and arch nemeses, and it is just perfect. It is so fun and actually pretty emotional by the end of it, and I just love it with all my being. So I now consider my 2022 reading to be officially wrapped up. So let's look ahead to this year, to 2023, and talk about the couple of reading and bookish goals I have. In terms of an official number of books I'd like to read this year, I think I'm gonna officially say my goal is 23 books for 2023. Sounds nice. I'm almost definitely going to exceed this unless something really drastic happens. But I know that setting myself a higher target, even if it's more like realistic or ends up being closer to the actual number of books I finish, it will just stress me out. And we're going into 2023 with as little stress as possible. My next goal is to read a book from every single continent. I've done a special spread in my reading journal for this, and I'm very excited for it. As you could tell from the stats portion of this video, I did not do a very good job with reading diversely in 2022. So this goal is to try and remedy that, along with my next goal, which is to read from 10 new to me POC authors in 2023. I had similar goals to these in 2022, obviously miserably failed at them. So I'm once again attempting to diversify my reading, both in terms of like race and ethnicity, but also in terms of global location. And let's hope I can actually achieve that this year. My next goal is to read more at breakfast. And this is quite a niche and specific goal. But basically as a kid, I used to read every single morning while I was eating my cereal before school. And I read so much that way. I read so much as a child, like way more than I can ever hope to dream to read as an adult. And I can pinpoint the exact moment I stopped doing this. And it's when I was 18 and I got an iPhone for my birthday. And in the, over 9 years since then, I have gone on my phone at breakfast every single day of my life, and it's very much cut into my reading time. So I would like to start undoing this habit if at all possible. I mean, the obvious answer to this is just to read ebooks on my phone at breakfast, but we'll see how successful this is. Next, I would like to host another month-long Bookstagram challenge. I did one of these in July 2022 and it was so much fun. It had a lot of prep work went into it, and actually some of it was kind of wasted. I made a nice graphic for myself, but all of the day specific prompts, I managed to mess up and put them like a day late. So I know what not to do this time. And like, did many people participate? No. Was it still fun? And would I like to do it again? Yes. My next goal, which is kind of like my biggest one, I would say, is I'd love to start an Etsy shop to sell reading journal printables. I am now in my 3rd year of keeping a reading journal, and I really love it. I really love coming up with ideas for pages and working out exactly how to format them and then setting them up. And I think it could be a lot of fun to make, I don't know, like PDFs or something of them for people to print out and use. I just think that could be really fun. So stay tuned, because I'm sure if that does end up happening, I will start heavily plugging it on this channel. And my last goal for 2023 is to take part in NaNoWriMo. This is pretty much a given. I've done it for 8 years now. 2023 will be my 9th year of participating. It's always so much fun. It was a particular win for me in 2022 because it was the first year I like stuck with the same story for the entire month. I did a nice little vlog for NaNoWriMo, which you can check out if you want to. But it was just a really fun time, and I'm already looking forward to participating this year. So thank you for watching this very, very long and I'm sure rambly and quite intensely condensed video. I had a really fun time reading in 2022. I'm looking forward to what the next year has in store for me, and I hope you are too. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.